All right, everybody, welcome back. Ready to dive into another deep dive with us today?
Absolutely. Raring to go.
Today we're looking at a dark and honestly really captivating period in American history. We are talking about the Salem witch trials.
Absolutely.
So, we've all heard the stories, right? The images of those trials,
Yeah.
they kind of stick with you. But for this deep dive, we wanted to really try to understand what happened, like how an entire community could just unravel in that way. And thankfully, we've got some excellent source material to dig into.
Yeah, definitely. I think, when we talk about the Salem witch trials, it's really easy to sort of view it as this isolated incident, it's this weird thing that happened back in the 1600s, a long time ago. But when you actually get into it, you see that it's not that simple, right? It reveals these kind of underlying fault lines in society. You've got fear, you've got religious extremism, and honestly, maybe even just a little dash of biological factors that we don't totally understand.
It's true, and our listeners love that kind of stuff, so
Yeah.
let's get into it.
So,
We're in the late 1600s, Puritan New England. What is it that actually sets this whole chain of events into motion?
well, so it starts, in Salem Village, and there are these young girls who begin exhibiting, honestly, some really bizarre, really unsettling behavior.
Yeah, and the sources describe it as convulsions, hallucinations.
Yeah, totally. I mean, we're talking fits, uncontrollable screaming, just the stuff of nightmares, really.
Yeah, I mean, imagine in that time period where talk the devil, witchcraft, it wasn't just a scary story. People really believed in that stuff.
Oh, absolutely. This was a community that was deeply, deeply steeped in religious belief. And so when these girls start acting in this way, I mean, it's not a huge leap to then jump to.
Yeah.
Something's wrong. Something supernatural is happening here.
Totally. But I mean, we go from a few sick girls to a full-blown witch hunt pretty fast, right?
Right. And that's, I think, where it gets really interesting, from a historical perspective.
Okay.
So driven by fear, and I think probably some underlying social tensions that were already bubbling beneath the surface, these girls start accusing specific women in the village of bewitching them.
It's so interesting how, I don't know, fear and rumor and suspicion can just spread like wildfire. And that's kind of what happened here, right?
Yeah, it's like a social wildfire, right?
Yeah.
You can almost picture it, right? You're in this small, isolated community. Suddenly, your neighbor, who you thought you knew, is being accused of communing with the devil. And it's just this immediate escalation of suspicion.
I mean, talk about an awkward neighborhood potluck.
Right. And so you have this situation where, accusations start flying, paranoia is rampant. It really does seem like everyone becomes suspicious of everyone else. And this kind of desperate need to root out the evil that's perceived to be lurking within Salem just spirals out of control.
And, reading through these sources, what really struck me, and I think this is important to remember, is that the legal system back then, I mean, it was basically the Wild West of justice, right?
Oh, totally.
No defense attorneys, evidence that we would laugh out of court today.
Right, the concept of spectral evidence.
Oh, yeah, talk about that for a second.
So spectral evidence was basically the accuser would claim that they saw the accused person's spirit harming them.
Oh, wow.
And that was considered legitimate evidence. So imagine being condemned to death because someone said that they saw your ghostly apparition. I don't know.
Stealing their prize-winning pumpkin.
Right, exactly. I mean, that was enough to seal your fate. It's really hard for us to wrap our heads around that today.
Absolutely. It's chilling, really. But it wasn't just this, flawed legal system, right? Our sources talk about there were some other possible explanations for what was happening in Salem, right?
Right, yeah, absolutely. And I think one of our most fascinating ones is this idea of ergot poisoning. Have you ever heard of that?
I have, yeah. Tell us a little bit more.
So ergot is this fungus that can grow on rye grain, and rye was a staple crop back in those days, right?
Great.
But here's the thing. If you eat bread that's made with ergot-contaminated rye, it can cause some really, really intense symptoms.
It's true. Hallucinations, convulsions.
Oh, yeah. Even gangrene in really severe cases.
Yeah.
And what's so interesting is that these symptoms, they can actually mimic, the symptoms of what people back then thought was bewitchment.
Wow, yeah. That is a really, really strong argument for that being a contributing factor. So you're saying a bad loaf of bread could have basically tipped the scales towards this mass hysteria. I'm suddenly feeling maybe I want to go gluten-free. I don't know.
Yeah, well, it's definitely, it's a theory that holds water, and a lot of historians do believe that ergot poisoning played a pretty significant role in what happened in Salem. But, we also have to remember the human element here, right? Like, life in Salem, it wasn't some idyllic Puritan utopia. Or
Totally.
sources talk about, like, there were some serious tensions simmering beneath the surface of this community.
Yeah.
Land disputes, economic anxieties, power struggles. I mean, just like any community, right? There's always going to be some level of, like, conflict.
Right, totally.
Yeah.
So then you add in this element of, like, okay, well, if we accuse someone of witchcraft, that's a way to get rid of our rivals. It's a way to maybe, like, get their property or just, like, get ahead. So it's almost like this really, really messed up game of Survivor, but, like, Salem edition, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really, really dark way to think about it. But I think you're right. When you combine those kinds of motivations, those very human, selfish motivations, with a society that's already primed to believe in the supernatural, it creates this, like, perfect storm for this kind of tragedy to unfold.
It's just amazing, but also sad how easily people can get swept up in that,
It is.
Like how vulnerable we are to manipulation and fear, especially when you wrap it up in something that's bigger than ourselves, whether it's religion or ideology, whatever it is.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's, what makes the Salem witch trials still so relevant, even though it happened centuries ago. It still has this power to really make us think, make us question. And for me, the biggest takeaway is just this. It's like a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked fear, mass hysteria, and just like what happens when the justice system goes completely off the rails.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it makes you wonder, right? Like if something similar were to happen today in our modern world with all of our scientific advancements, with psychology, with everything that we know, like would we be able to stop it?
Yeah.
Or would we fall prey to the same kind of like mass panic and fear mongering?
Yeah, that's like the million-dollar question, isn't it? And honestly, there's no easy answer. Part of me wants to say, of course, we're more advanced now. We wouldn't make the same mistakes. But then again, history has a way of repeating itself, especially when fear and ignorance enter the picture.
That's very true. Well, on that note, I want to encourage everyone listening, don't just stop with our conversation here. Take the time to explore those source materials. Really get into the individual stories, the accusations, the ripple effects that this had on Salem. Because the more we understand what happened then, the better equipped we are to recognize the warning signs and maybe hopefully prevent something similar from happening again.
Well said. All right, everybody, until next time.
We'll see you for another D-Stop.